Hello everyone and welcome to House, the Shared Living podcast. We're continuing our special series exploring some of the most important issues shaping the shared living and rental sectors. As always, House brings you the latest news, views and insights from across PBSA, BTR, co-living, university accommodation, HMO and rented later living. And today we're discussing a fascinating new report from Housing Hand, Understanding Renters in 2026. But first, I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategist.
I'm Dan Smith from Resi Consultancy and Verbaflow AI.
And apologies from Dani. You just have Dan and myself today. But we have some special guests as well, more from them in a minute. At a time when the Renters' Rights Act represents one of the biggest changes to renting in a generation, Housing Hand surveyed more than 1,600 renters across the UK and Ireland to understand how renters are feeling, what they know about the changes ahead, and where the biggest challenges remain. This survey is built on initial findings from 12 months previously, and the results revealed something surprising. So whilst policymakers and operators are focused on legislative change, renters themselves are struggling with something more fundamental, just understanding how renting works. We'll be discussing renter confidence, financial literacy, guarantors, wellbeing, student accommodation, and what the sector can do to bridge the growing knowledge gap. To help us unpack these findings, we are delighted to welcome James and Dani from Housing Hand. Can you start introducing yourselves and tell us a little bit about what inspired this piece of research? Dani, I'll come to you first.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dani Smith. I'm the sales manager at Housing Hand. So I've been with the company for nearly 6 years, working very closely with accommodation providers across the rental sector. So I'm really looking forward to discussing the findings from our Understanding Renters survey and sharing some of the key insights into the renters' experiences and knowledge gaps that are happening at the moment. So I think the reason for the survey, we actually did a similar one back in February 2025. And it was all about what are the knowledge gaps in the market, how are tenants coping with the new legislative changes with the Renters' Rights Act. We thought that this year we would do a survey asking some of the same questions and obviously just throwing some new bits in there as well. But just to really get an understanding of what has changed over the last year, are there still knowledge gaps and what can we do as an industry together to help build those knowledge gaps and just ensure that everyone's on the same page, whether you're an accommodation provider or a tenant. So yeah, looking forward to running through some of those findings with you guys.
Perfect, Dani. And James.
Hi there, I'm James Maguire and I'm the Sales and Business Development Director at Housing Hand. I've been in the property market for nearly 20 years now, showing my age. But yes, without doubt, renters' rights is a generational change. And I think affecting students in particular, which, 65% of our guaranteed tenants are international students. So they're living away from home for the first time in their lives in a different country. So really understanding the whole rental process and financial literacy, all of the areas we're covering today is so important for them and so important for the market and us as a group to educate them on. So really excited about discussing those issues today.
I think a good place to start is probably highlighting some of the key findings. Obviously, the full report is available on your website, but for anyone that hasn't read it yet, the key findings are that 78% of the people surveyed do not understand how the Renters' Rights Act impacts them. 88% didn't know when the legislation came into effect. 69% report negative emotions towards renting, including feeling overwhelmed, uncertain or anxious. 79% say renting affects their well-being. 66% are worried about affording the property they want. And 46% wouldn't know what to do if they couldn't pay their rent. First question to you guys. Were you surprised by the scale of the knowledge gap?
To be honest, I think when I first saw the stats, it does kind of throw you back a little bit because they are very large numbers. So when you see those numbers, it's like, wow, was you really expecting the numbers to be that high? But then if you take a little bit more of a delve into it, I think everyone across the industry, obviously, we're all skilled in what we do. We talk about these things on a day-to-day basis. But if you're a tenant, I mean, especially a young person, a student who's just moving out of their home with their mum and their dad, you're not really going to be interested in renters' rights. That's probably not what you're looking at when you're scrolling through Facebook, or if anyone actually uses Facebook anymore, maybe TikTok. But people, if you're not in this industry, it's a difficult thing to navigate. I mean, back when I was in school, obviously I lived with my parents, I'm a renter myself. If I didn't work in this industry, I wouldn't have a clue what renters' rights is. I think a lot of accommodation providers, obviously, they're issuing their statement notice of the changes with renters' rights. But other than that, what is there to actually educate tenants? I think people are heavily relying on the accommodation providers and the universities to do this job. Has obviously been some details that have gone out from the government, but I think most of that is related to the changes for the accommodation providers. So I think seeing these stats has obviously just really given us more of an insight as to what education needs to be done. And that's why we've been working so closely with a lot of our university partners, the accommodation providers. We've been sending out emails to tenants and just helping them understand their rights, really, because it is a difficult task to follow up on, especially where everyone in this industry is so busy. Finding time to obviously reach out to your tenants and make sure that they know what's going on. It takes a lot of time, especially if you're a big accommodation provider.
Yeah, I was going to say, just following on from what Dani's saying, I think, she's correct. There's such big numbers. It's no surprise to me that they are big numbers because the market is still trying to get to grips with renters' rights. We're seeing this every day at Housing Hand when we're talking to our accommodation partners. They don't understand what tenancy types, because there's different sectors. You've got build to rent, you've got HMO sector, and of course the PBSA sector, which is exempt for any tenancies after the 1st of May. And I think that's where I think the confusion, so if the market doesn't know enough about it, then of course that's not going to filter down to the tenants, which I think is something that we all have to work together on, in terms of getting them more, up to date with what's going on and what their tenancies look like.
Do you think the sector has underestimated the amount of educating that renters might need, or do you think this is more of a sort of government lack of understanding as to exactly how we can educate people, but also then feeding that down to operators as well? I'm just conscious as to where the sort of gap sits, really. Is this more of a policy thing, or is this more of a, an operator thing?
I think it's a mixture of everything. I think the government, even though they've taken over what was renters reform from the previous government and near enough cut and paste the same, bill, which became an act. But then a lot of the communication to the market came very late in the day. I mean, there was communications going out literally a week before the 1st of May deadline. So the market really found out about it at a late stage. There was also a lot of the market almost wishing it would go away in the nicest possible way, because it was such a massive change. And then, of course, I think, universities, student unions have really tried to educate students. We've worked with, a lot of the unis. We've done roundtable events with Cubo, with Hauser, to talk about renters' rights so they can then educate their students. But I think there's still not enough going on about it, the market. I mean, I spoke to a family member recently who just didn't have a clue. They were signing a tenancy agreement from a landlord that was still saying that it was a fixed term, even though it wasn't. So there's a lot of educating and a lot of planning, I think, that needs to go into it. If you think of the first day at a new building, when a tenant arrives, they get shown the fire exits, they get shown, but are they being given that rental sort of information? Some operators absolutely will be doing it, but some probably just say, here's your keys, there's your room, off you go. And I think that's something that has to change in terms of educating them and giving them a whistle-stop tour of what the rental process looks like.
I mean, where does the responsibility lie, though? I mean, you guys have taken it upon yourselves to survey renters for the last 2 years. And on the back of that, obviously, you're able to educate your customers, your renters that you've got. But where else does it lie? I guess, where were tenants currently getting their information from, and who should be doing it, really?
I think it sort of falls on everyone within the industry, really. It's our job to educate the tenants, whether you're an accommodation provider, a university, a build-to-rent or a PBSA. I think sometimes it has been made a little bit difficult because of the way that information has actually been perceived. If you speak to various companies like we do, obviously we partner with over 4,000 accommodation providers, and some of the differences in knowledge have just been absolutely insane. And it's not necessarily anyone's fault. I think there's been a little bit of of Chinese whispers almost. Someone hears one thing and then they relay it to someone, missing out little bits of information. Legal teams have got different views on where things sit with certain pieces of the legislation. So I think everyone just needs to make sure that they're communicating as a whole and looking at the actual facts and making sure that we're feeding these onto tenants, and just continuing to do some of that great work that's been done, especially with some of the university partners putting FAQs on their websites, doing those roundtable events, hosting webinars. It just needs to be spoken about a lot, because it's one of those things as well. Like even us, when we attend the student housing fairs, we're like, we're obviously a guarantor service. This is what we do. Do you know about the renters' rights? And sometimes they'll turn around and say, yeah, I've heard of it. So what do you actually know about it? Oh, I'm allowed to take a pet into the property now. And then that's sort of something that everyone's remembered. But no one really tends to understand if they'll be able to give 2 months notice, because it's not just about some of the facts in there. It's actually understanding what type of tenancy you're in, because you might hear that you can give 2 months notice, but if you're staying in a PBSA with a fixed term, that 2 months notice just doesn't apply to you. So I think there's just so many different angles and ways to look at it. So like James said, I think at the beginning, when they're moving into that property, the changes need to be made super clear. And to some tenants, it's not even going to be a change. It's going to be their first time renting. These are going to be the rules that obviously stick with them essentially moving forward now. So yeah, I think the information sheets are great, but how do we put that into a more student orientated way rather than just a piece of paper with some bullet points? Do we need to do more on other methods such as TikTok and YouTube and some of the other forums out there as well?
I think what you're saying, Dani, really relates to that statistic that I said at the beginning, that 69% of renters report negative emotions towards renting. And you kind of think, well, actually, is it because they said that they're overwhelmed, uncertain and anxious, but, confusion probably comes into it as well. It must be hugely, scary renting for the first time. And, James, you mentioned international students specifically. I mean, I can't even imagine renting in a different country where maybe the language isn't my first language. And I know that these legislative rules will become normal, like you said, Dani. They will, future renters won't know any different. And hopefully that will kind of aid the transparency of it and encourage all of these operators and accommodation providers and universities to be more transparent with it. But there is this transition period that is scary and confusing for everyone. I was at a Class Foundation event last week, and even amongst professionals, there's still so many uncertainties and questions as well. So kind of, it's not surprising really, that knowledge gap being there. I don't think, it is a huge change. Just going back to the research for a minute, what stood out for you the most? Obviously, I just whistle-stopped through some highlights, but there's so much to the report. What stood out for you both?
I think probably the thing that has stood out in both reports, like the 25 and the 26 report, a real common theme going through it is stress, anxiety, well-being. I think a lot of that is linked to affordability. Can I afford to pay my rent? When you look at a UK student, most UK students, their student finance probably only just about covers the rent. So where can they live? Even professionals, it's between 40 and 50% of rent. When you would start adding on utilities and all the other things, it's pretty much putting you on a tight shoestring budget, so to speak. So I think it's really, really important that we do things to try and help people get over that, which is why, of course, we last year we launched our health and wellbeing service, giving people access to 24/7 GPs and counsellors, wellbeing professionals to be able to assist them. And back to what we said earlier on about international students living in another country. I mean, when we go on holiday for 2 weeks, sometimes we go to countries and it takes us time to adapt. These people are staying for years, and it's a real stressful time for them, and we need to make that as smooth as possible. And it comes back again to the educating and the getting them to understand. But of course, a theme that, like yourself, Sarah and Dan, we've been to quite a few events in recent weeks, and affordability is coming up again and again. And I think affordability is the thing that leads to stress and anxiety, because you might on the face of it see this beautiful room and think, God, I'm looking forward to living in that. And then suddenly it dawns on you when the big bill comes, your first month's rent comes in, or your first term's rent comes in, you go, how am I going to be able to afford this ongoing? And that's where I think the stress is.
I think adding to that as well, like if you're an international student, for example, and you don't necessarily know the area so well, or even if you're UK and you're moving to a different place in the UK, it's all well and good, obviously, finding a property, thinking, oh yeah, I love that one. That one's really nice. It's an expensive rent. And then thinking, I have got enough money to obviously manage that, but then maybe not taking your travel costs into consideration, or realising how much it's actually going to cost you to commute back and forward from the university, or just the general living costs. If you've been living at home with your mum and dad and they've been cooking your meals, then realising how much it actually costs to eat on your own and have those additional costs, really. So yeah, I think that as well is something that needs to be done as an education piece. I know some of the marketplace companies, they tend to put a little bit about what the expenses are living in different cities, but is that something that's on all of the PBSA websites or the BTR websites? So yeah, I think all of those things combined really would help to push that piece a little bit further.
I think some other statistics that have stood out for me, sort of based on kind of what you were just talking about, really. 47% of people in shared homes don't understand what happens if housemates move out at different times. You know, that's quite a shocking statistic. That's almost 50% of people that are going into living with other people, which obviously is quite common with students and graduates and young people, but they don't really understand the implications of it at all. And only 45% understand right to rent checks. So it does feel like there's this sort of, I don't know how you describe it, a conveyor belt, a treadmill of process that's just sort of going on without people really engaging in it. And I know that's part of why the Renters' Rights Act is here. It's to kind of slow it down, really, particularly with HMOs, obviously the restriction on when you can advertise the property, et cetera, that maybe people will give themselves a bit longer to, you know, think about things and consider it and maybe do a bit more research. And when the supply and demand is imbalanced, people don't have time. You know, we've seen all of the stories for years gone by of people, you know, queuing up and, you know, signing tenancies for the first property they see because they're terrified that it's going to go and they're going to be homeless. That's not really the case anymore. So we might see a kind of a natural, I guess, you know, move towards renters educating themselves more. Plus AI, you know, they can ask all these questions a bit more as well.
I think that's a really good point. I think that part of the problem that we've got with educating ourselves about guarantors or renting or anything along those lines is that we have incredibly onerous contracts, and you know, they are quite scary. I remember signing one when I was a student and thinking, God, I feel like I'm signing my life away here. I think it's really interesting that, you know, 37% of people didn't know what a guarantor was before being asked for one. I do think this is one of the positives of AI here, in that you're just going to ask a question and get an instant answer rather than trawling through a massive document. And I think hopefully that will start to help, because I just don't think that we've educated people well enough going through school, and then equally, you know, when you get to university, a lot of the times it's first year halls, second year maybe HMO, PBSA, or BTR. I think that's where we've, you know, do you think we've forgotten to educate those customers through the course of their education?
I think it's actually something that we've discussed internally, is how can you get higher up that funnel and start to educate people before they move into university? Because like you say, Dan, a lot of people, they'll go into uni halls the first year round. They don't need a guarantor generally for uni halls, although that does seem to be changing. We are starting to get some universities actually guaranteeing their halls, obviously due to debt issues and other various things. But I think if we could start that education piece higher up the funnel, from secondary school or middle school, and just through various routes, then it would help prepare people rather than everything falling on top of them at once. And it's just a lot of information to take in over a short space of time at the moment, really. So I completely agree. AI could be a massive help in that, as well as going further up that funnel.
Yeah, we're currently speaking to a lot of Chinese agents and marketplaces, and they're asking because they want to educate their students at an earlier stage. So even before they're going through the booking process, they're trying to educate them so they understand their rights, they understand. And actually, as a result, we've already seen a flip of Chinese students that are booking. So our early signs, we're not in peak season yet, but our early signs is we're seeing quite a few of our Chinese students booking BTR ahead of PBSA. So because they're being educated into the fact that you can give 2 months notice, you can pay monthly rather than upfront. And so they're changing their habits. Obviously, some will always still stay in the PBSA side of things because they want to just get the rent out the way. They want that fixed term to understand where the start and finish of their tenancy, and that's why I think it will still always have a place in that. But as Dani rightly says, I mean, these are things that we're trying to do is educate at an earlier stage. Again, we work with some embassies, from the Middle East, and we're talking about webinars with their parents before they send their kids to the UK to talk about the rental process, and of course where we fit into that as a guarantor, if a guarantor is needed in that respect. These are things that we're certainly starting to do, but certainly want more. Again, Dan, you mentioned AI, and we embrace AI ourselves, and we've noticed a massive reduction in the amount of calls that get through to our CX team because the questions are answered before through VerbaFlow, and I think that's really, really useful. And then we've also got other AI initiatives in our CRM system as well that helps get messages out to tenants. And I think you're right. Even somebody getting an APT, as it's now known, or a common law tenancy, they might be able to use AI just to say, please just summarize this and give me the main points. And rather than, as you say, read 8 pages of quite legal stuff that they don't really understand. So, agree that these initiatives and innovations will really help.
I think on the basis that 81% of respondents in your survey wish they had received more financial education, does feel like this has all been a bit of a wake-up call, really. I mean, I've been now hearing about operators going into sixth forms and high schools to talk, and we're not talking about them going in and selling, we're talking about them going in and educating and just advising people what's going on here. So it's moving in the right direction, it sounds like it, and it was much needed. Dan, did you want to pick up?
So James, I think you've just given us a really good insight there that will be probably quite concerning for PBSA operators by the fact that there's a significant number of Chinese students working with marketplaces, which are very high up the funnel. They're really helping from fairly early on in the student's journey. And the education piece for them is around the fact that BTR can offer more flexibility than PBSA. And therefore, at the moment, it sounds like more Chinese students are being swayed by that flexibility in BTR. It's good and it's concerning because, the customer's right. If they want flexibility, they'll go and find somewhere that offers them flexibility. It's the same with student HMO as well. But yeah, that's just a really interesting trend to see this year, especially that obviously it's mandated. You can give 2 months notice in BTR or, in your student HMO. I am waiting with bated breath to see what the impact is going to be on PBSA, but just really interesting that you can pick that out and see that data coming through in the calls and the messages that you're getting and the bookings that you're getting. So yeah, I just wanted to just highlight that.
Just to add to that, I think what's interesting is some of our PBSA partners have already preempted this because they have got other models to offer their students. So we have one partner who has BTR assets. They also have a big HMO. So when they've got a student that says, I want them flexible options, they can say, well, we don't have them flexible options here, but we have them there. And so they're able to keep the customer. And I think that's really important. We're also seeing a few PBSAs that are now starting to offer more flexible payment options that would historically not do that, because they see what's coming or what's here. So I think they're doing some really good work behind the scenes as well to make sure that they offer different options to people that want those different options. Of course, you'll still have a high percentage of Chinese students, some US students, some students from GCC countries that will want to pay their rent up front. And so they will always move towards that model that allows them to do that, because their parent just wants to get the rent out of the way, as I said earlier. And I think that they'll still have that comfort blanket to a degree, but I think the dynamic is definitely changing.
Are you seeing PBSA operators, as we've been saying, be more student? I think now is the time for PBSA operators to really scream and shout about all the things they do for students, particularly because that's quite a different model. It's a different environment for people to live in if you're in PBSA versus BTR or co-living or HMOs. Are you kind of seeing PBSA, I guess, rise to the challenge, really?
100%. I think over the last year or so, we've noticed that a lot of our PBSA partners are trying really hard to retain their previous customers. Because I think obviously occupancy last year as a whole, it wasn't necessarily the best occupancy rates that they've ever had. So we've actually heard a lot of PBSAs at various events saying what they're doing in terms of events, hosting like Christmas parties, Eid parties, different sort of nationality celebrations, and just trying to make sure that they bring everybody in those properties together and retain them for the next year, because it's easier to obviously retain customers than it is to go out and get new ones. So we've definitely seen increased renewal rates across our PBSA partners, but we're definitely also seeing an increase in tenants moving over to BTR and co-living, like Dan mentioned. So the numbers have actually gone up drastically for HMO and BTR compared to PBSA.
Wow, that's a really good insight. And Sarah, I know that on the podcast we've been saying that, this was the year of the rebooker, where hopefully everybody was doubling down on the fact that you've got to keep those residents happy. So, I think that's a really, really good point to make.
I wonder as well if there's just a little bit of safety in it as well. If they have caught wind that there are changes, or maybe they've gone to letting agents or they've gone to other operators who are maybe not being very clear and very transparent, it's kind of safer to stay where you are. Yes, obviously there's this transition period this summer, but it still feels like maybe if you've done a really great job in looking after your tenants, they'll feel looked after, they'll trust you, and that will pay dividends, as especially as we're saying about transparency about renting. If they really looked after students and held their hands through this process, then that's a really positive thing, and like I said, not a bad outcome of what the renters' rights has become, really.
I totally agree, Sarah. Just on that, I'll just add into that is whereas these operators develop other sort of products as well, such as BTR and HMO, if they have a great experience going through that process and they feel educated, then guess what? When they go out into the professional market, they can say, do you know what? I want to rent a property from you. So I'll stay with you, but in one of your other models. So I'll go and move into one of your BTRs, or I'll stay in a house share or whatever. So the lifetime value of that potential student stroke working professional is something that I imagine many businesses will be looking at as an opportunity.
On that topic, James, it's probably a good segue to talk about the future. Really, obviously, this has been a little bit of a transition period. We said it, this whole stage of renting will normalise. I can't see it really settling down for another year or so. Is that what you guys think as well? Are you still kind of on this mission to educate renters and operators and landlords for the next 12 months? You think we're still in a transition period and will be for some time?
100%. I think nobody really likes change, and it takes some time to get used to those changes. But I think we're definitely seeing some progress being made. Like I mentioned earlier, there's lots of webinars, lots of emails and things like that going out. But I think until this cycle has actually come to an end, people will then start to realize, oh, wait, I could have given my notice, or, oh, wait, if I stayed in a PBSA, my friend just told me that I could have paid in full. So I think it's just going to take a little bit of trial and error, really, as well, in order to make sure that everyone is educated. But I think eventually, over time, like we said at the beginning, it will just become the new norm. I mean, in Scotland, where they've obviously got the PRT and rolling contracts, we also work with a lot of accommodation providers in Scotland. And one of the questions that I had for one of our partners was, how did you guys find it when changes like that previously happened? And it just seems to be normal. Like no one really had anything bad to say. So yeah, I think we'll get there in the end, and we just all need to work together and try and educate everyone, accommodation providers and tenants alike.
Yeah, I think the last major legislative change that happened was the Tenant Fee Act in 2019, and it took accommodation providers a little time to adjust to that, to tenant fees, because some accommodation providers before that used to charge for viewings, they used to charge for all sorts of things, but then they were restricted in what they could charge for, and most areas were, they couldn't, and I think. But they've now adjusted to it. It takes a bit of time, and I think the market will. But as Dani says, and I think as we all agree, it'll take a bit of time. And I think it's about us all collaborating as an industry. Us working with our university partners, our PBSA partners, our BTR, our HMO, letting agents, because letting agents have such a mix of clients. Students and professionals and people, in social housing. It's really difficult sometimes for them to get the right messaging across because they're talking to, 1,000 tenants and they're a mixture of all of the above. And whereas I think in the student market, they can actually specifically tailor the messaging to students. So I think it's about us working with those different sectors to try and get the information out there and get people more comfortable in talking about it and subsequently, educating the market about it.
So we've talked on the podcast quite a lot about, I guess, the perception of renting, and the, particularly, I guess, changes in government and finance policy, etc. That's all being very much geared towards people buying homes, and that being, the dream and the aspiration of everyone. And I know that, the point of the Renters' Rights Act is really to professionalise the sector. And I think all the things we've talked about today will, hopefully do that. On that basis, if we sort of fast forwarded 12 months and you were to do your survey again, what do you think it would look like?
That's a really good question. So I do think that over the next year, some of the stats will definitely change, because when we did the survey in 2025, I believe it was 69% of renters hadn't heard of renters' rights, and 75% said they didn't know how it might impact them. So I think the number of people hearing about the renters' rights will definitely increase. And obviously people will start to have a better understanding on how it will impact them. But James mentioned a moment ago, before the Tenant Fee Act, people could obviously charge for viewings. When he said that, it was like, wow, can you ever imagine a world where you'd be allowed to actually charge people for viewings? So I think the dynamic will just shift completely, but it will be very interesting to see, because I was expecting there to be a bigger change in numbers from our last survey in February 25 compared to the February 26 survey. But to be honest with you, some of the changes were very, very minuscule. So it just goes to show that there isn't enough education. So hopefully, with everybody all putting in work together, we will see a bigger change in those numbers. It would be good to make sure that more people are educated, for sure.
I think more and more businesses are looking now at the well-being of their tenants, and obviously the sector we work in, students especially. Again, we were at ASRA recently, and we were talking to some of our accommodation partners and universities, and they're putting more programs in to try and help. I think we've always talked about financial literacy as really important. I think getting people to understand how to manage their finances is so important. I remember when I moved out of home for the first time, and you've got rent or you've got a mortgage to pay, and then you think, but I can still go out and do this and do that, and then you realise you actually have to sort of tailor what you're doing. And I think educating people around that is going to be important. If we continue doing that, then that's going to reduce the amount of stress and anxiety that people feel about the rental process, which has come through in our survey, both surveys. It's quite, as I said earlier on, it's highlighted significantly. But I think if we continue doing that, and as I say, some PBSA partners have their own wellbeing service. They have an app, where you can go on there and talk to somebody and ask for advice. There's so many innovative solutions coming. AI will also help with that as well, most definitely, if it's positioned in the right way. You don't want to take the human element out of it either. If somebody wants to speak to somebody, then they can still speak to a human when they need to. I think universities, as we know, there's a lot of financial challenges there. So they're trying to balance the well-being of their students with, of course, balancing the books, which is an ongoing challenge. And Dani alluded to it earlier on. We're already having universities approach us regarding some of our, our products and our new products, such as our student rent guarantee insurance and of course other debt management solutions that we're working on with and if they can take that out and obviously get to the problem early, and that's something we've really focused on ourselves. So, in the last 4 years, we've settled nearly £6 million in claims. And in 25% of those cases, we've got the tenant back on board. So there's been, happy tenant, happy landlord. So if that removes the stress, then of course, that's where I want to see that more than anything go down in our survey, that the actual stress and anxiety levels are reducing because we're coming together as a sector to try and help and educate them.
Yeah, I think one of those statistics that we talked about at the beginning, 46% wouldn't know what to do if they couldn't pay their rent. And I understand that's quite a scary thing for landlords and operators to tell people up front, because it's like they don't want to encourage people to default on their rent. But like you said, with rent being so high and affordability being such an issue, you kind of have to just confront these things up front. I think they're happening anyway. And, isn't it better that people kind of know that they are supported? This isn't a scary thing. They don't have to turn to drastic measures or, like you said, James, just leave, default completely. There are ways of being supported, obviously, through yourselves as well. I've just got a really controversial thing that I'm going to throw into the mix that we hadn't planned at all, because we couldn't, because it was announced today that under 16s are to be banned from social media. And that includes Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and X. And I know we're predominantly talking about, obviously, renters who are, 18 plus, but we've just been talking about how people need to be educated younger. And a lot of those channels that young people would have got their information from would be social media. And obviously, there's so much social media that's absolutely awful and terrible. But there's an element of it that has been used, to educate people. So obviously it's breaking news, so I don't expect you to have a reaction on that. But I do think it's interesting, you talked, Dani, about kind of really reaching out to people in the way that they can relate to. And a lot of the time that is on TikTok and YouTube videos. Oh my God, I know that I look on YouTube videos of how to do this, how to do that, all the time, and I know that young people do as well. Any reaction to that breaking news?
Overall, I mean, personally, I think it's a good thing to obviously ban social media for under 16s, but like you say, there is going to be definitely some positive parts in there that they could use as well. Like, I have got 2 children, and I don't necessarily let them use YouTube or anything like that, but sometimes my daughter will come to me and she'll say, "Oh, can you show me how to do a tutorial on YouTube?" or something like that. So I 100% agree that there are good parts and bad. I think with obviously the banning of that, should it be more of a responsibility for schools to take on, or for parents as well? Parents should obviously be educating their children before they go off into the big wide world. So maybe we need to start targeting some of those channels to actually target the parents of children and schools as well. And
just to add to that, I think I agree, Sarah, that it's going to cut off certain. But remember, it's under 16s, and if you all 4 of us on the call remember, when you're waiting with anticipation until you hit that milestone, so you can apply for your provisional driving license, and you literally do it on the day of after your birthday. And I think with social media, I think that those children that can't currently access social media, as soon as they hit 16, they're going to be opening up accounts because they'll legitimately be allowed to. And then, of course, a lot of social media platforms are seeing all the adverts over the TV around teen accounts. And those teen accounts will be 16 to 19 now, but those teen accounts are restricted in certain elements. But that's when you'll be able to then start educating them. And hopefully, because there is more restrictions in terms of what people can do, they'll get better messaging. So you hope that that's a byproduct of this, that they actually are able to then use it for better purposes. So as you say, it was breaking news this morning, but I think it's been coming. I think Australia were the first to go with it. I think 6 months ago, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But you're right. I mean, as Dani, you rightly said, it's down to schools, parents to start educating, and as you say, let your child sit next to you and watch a tutorial video, as Dani has just shown as an example.
Yeah, I think, like you said, there could be a gap in knowledge, but other people need to pick up. And I guess the difference is that renting now is very different to when a lot of parents were renting, as well, and were students. And so, yeah, it's almost like this whole education process needs to sort of come down a generation, so that parents, schools, colleges, can advise people on new legislation and make sure that information is correct. So the more we talk about it, and not just amongst ourselves, but, cascading that down to, to the general public, the better. And I know, you guys with this survey, you've had, a huge amount of press coverage, which is great, but it's also a bit of a shame that not more people have done it really, that you've just taken it upon yourselves to do this. And that's the information that's come through. So keep up the good work. I can't wait to read the 2027 report when that comes out in a year. And, like you said, hopefully some of those metrics will have changed. We can't deny that the Renters' Rights Act may be transforming the rules of renting, but we are reminded that the knowledge and confidence, is just as important as legislation as well. Whether it's understanding rights, managing finances, navigating guarantors, or simply knowing where to turn to help, renters are clearly telling us that they want more support. So, for operators across PBSA, BTR, co-living and the wide rental sector, that presents both a challenge and an opportunity, really, as hopefully we've covered today. A huge thank you to our guests from Housing Hand. Thank you so much, Dani and James, for joining us and sharing the findings from this important research. I will say I've read the whole thing and we've only touch the surface on this podcast. So please learn more about the Housing Hand research and download it from the Housing Hand website. And don't forget to subscribe to House wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time as we continue to explore the people, ideas and the innovations shaping the future of shared living. Thank you very much.